Welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to talk about the tax burden. We have two things happening simultaneously which kind of appear to be like paradoxically impossible, which is number one, you have the tax burden at an all-time high, and that's true. You guys will see that, especially things like council tax rising really significantly. And at the same time, we have this situation where basically all government services seem to be collapsing simultaneously. Everything seems to be constantly in crisis, NHS in crisis, education is in crisis, especially things like local services are in crisis. So how can it be possible that on the one hand, taxes are the highest they've ever been, and on the other hand, government services are like the worst they've ever been, or they've been in decades? Taxes pay for government services, so if taxes are super high, how can government services be if you terrible? Own your own house outright, you don't need to pay rent, you don't need to pay mortgage, and basically your costs in life are very low compared to somebody else. Now let's imagine situation changes and suddenly you lose that house, you completely lose that house, and now you still need to live, but you don't own your house. Your costs will massively increase because you have to pay rent for a whole house, or you have to pay a mortgage on a whole house. So if you own your house, your expenditures in life are much lower than if you don't own your own house. Now, keep this example in mind, and we're going to start thinking about So what you can see in this graph is that all of the countries in this graph, the wealth holding of governments has decreased significantly over time. So that one line at the top is China. You won't be surprised, the Chinese government, it's essentially a communist country. The government owns a lot of the wealth in the country. The other countries on the graph are all Western countries. So you've got the USA on there, UK in there, Germany, Japan, I think France is on there. And the story of the rest of these countries is basically all the same. The wealth holding of the government has decreased significantly over time. And I want you to notice that in the case of both the UK and the US, that number went below 0% in the sort of early 2010s, so the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. So what that means is the total wealth of the UK government, the US government, and basically every other Western government is in a pretty similar situation, is now below zero. So that means these guys have debts bigger than their assets. So now note that that graph ends in 2014. The situation during COVID got significantly worse. So now these graphs will drop down significantly. And what you will see is significant negative wealth holding for the British government, for the American government, basically every Western government. So I think this is a really important thing for you to understand. And it really completely explains the situation that we are in. The reason that governments are having to charge much higher levels of tax to provide much worse levels of service is quite simply because governments are much, much poorer now. Governments are really poor. I mean, governments... So, this is the situation we are in. Government is taxing you a lot to pay for shitty services because government's bankrupt. And you can't afford to pay those taxes because ordinary families are bankrupt. And all of that wealth is gone to the rich who are going to use it to buy the rest of the wealth, making you even more bankrupt. And this, essentially, is the reason why what I always campaign for is significantly higher taxes because the very rich. I don't see any other way of you getting your assets. And I want to talk a little bit about how this could work, how we could make this society better. I think the only way you get wealth flowing in the other direction, you tax very rich people much, much more. You use that money to significantly reduce taxes on working people. Your taxes are less, so you start to be able to accumulate a bit of money. Rich people's taxes are much, much more, so they need to sell their assets in order to pay for the taxes. You've got more money. The rich need to sell assets. You, ordinary working families, can start to buy those assets back from the rich. If we don't tax them, they will continue to never sell any assets, have enormous amounts of passive income, which they and their kids will use to outcompete you and your kids for the assets which you currently own, and in the end your family will own nothing.